time. It's September 18th as we record this. We just had a second assassination attempt on former President Trump. We just had the pager attack by the Israeli army on Hezbollah. And I'm sure I'm forgetting some stuff, but it's like we just said before recording. It's just the cycle of insanity is going faster and faster. So, some thoughts from your end, Toby?
Yeah, so I think it's a great place to start. That the operational tempo, as we would call it, is increasing. Like everything's getting faster paced, and that's being reported on. Like it's hard to remember what the highlight of last week's news cycle was now, or if somebody mentions a notable event, the first assassination attempt of President Trump. It's kind of like when was that? Like your perception of time is just now getting distorted, quite simply, and that's interesting because what we tend to find, and the pandemic was a great example of that kind of slow burn SHTF, where it was undoubtedly that we were in a major event, but a lot of people at that time had sort of prepared, if anything, for that sort of fast burning SHTF, this intensive period, 1 or 2 weeks. You become the warlord and the hero, and then everything goes back to normal. And this just like grinding it out for 2 years was the major stay of the pandemic. That's what got people is like, this is just straight up not fun because there's just no end in sight. And sort of remember, the pandemic ended when the war in Ukraine began. It was literally a bait and switch news cycle within a week of that. And what we've seen over the last 2 years is that sort of, it's tipping away, it's ticking away. And people are talking about being prepared and escalation of events, but it's always seemed sort of far off. I think now we're getting into that compression phase of, we know in one notable event, whether it be an assassination or something else, a bunch of stuff can kick off really quickly at a major scale. And that's kind of, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand kind of territory of that. That was that sort of moment. No one knew it at the time, but that was effectively the precursor to the World War. Like everything just spiraled out of control from there. So we've got a lot of pressure in the system, a lot of momentum in the system, and a lot of fragility in the system simultaneously. That's always been there, but I really feel that compression now. And like you say, we're in September. October the 7th is coming, the 1 year anniversary of the attack on Israel. We've got the US election coming. We've got a bunch of European elections coming, and then we're into winter. And we know historically Russians weaponize winter. It's their greatest asset. So I think in this next 3 months, it's going to get very, very interesting on the back of this entire decade, which has been quite fascinating if you look at it objectively, or straight up sucks if you've been living in it, quite simply. And so we were sort of jokingly saying that we've thrown the bingo cards out now in 2024. You just can't keep up with it. And that's important to note. That is the situation we're in. It's very, very difficult to keep up with things now.
Yeah, total agreement. And something I tried to point out, and we talked about it a little bit before recording, and I mentioned that I had this online discussion when it comes to propaganda. But obviously, the Russian side does propaganda. Of course, they do. That's like duh. in every war, the first casualty is the truth, as the saying goes. So my point has always been like, well, yes, obviously, but then both sides will do that. All sides always do that. Why wouldn't they? This assumption that only the quote unquote, wrong side is doing propaganda is ludicrous. And we know that from before because we had basically ministries of propaganda from the First World War on and so on. So this hasn't gone away. Now the thing that is being posted as a response is then, well, yeah, but prove me that the Western governments are doing the same thing as the Russians with troll farms, posting, influencing public opinion and so on. And the point you made, which I think is very valid, is that they don't need to, because they own the access to the mainstream media and social media, especially in Europe, via legislation. As when we've seen this in the US with the Twitter files that exposed the massive influence of the US government on Twitter back in the day. Mark Zuckerberg has himself said, well, I would push back more next time if the government wants me to suppress the Hunter Biden laptop, which we know now, because the research has been done, that would have influenced the elections. And he says, sorry guys, my bad, won't do it again. So they don't need to have troll farms. They can actually influence and spread propaganda basically by just doing an interview on the nightly news whenever they want, which is what happens. So it's increasingly difficult for people to kind of know what's going on and have and just think coherently and as much as possible neutrally without then that doesn't imply that we are fans of the opposing side or approve of what they do. It's just you can very much look at something objectively and say like, okay, this is what caused it. You just said the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. By pointing out that this was what triggered the rest, you don't agree with it, and we've kind of lost this concept of just rational discourse like that due to the radicalization that we've had for so many years. And now, as the cycle keeps going faster and faster, and like you said, the I mean, even 2 days after the first Trump assassination attempt, it was like old news. It was no longer a headline. If I'm not mistaken, there was one FBI press conference afterwards, and there was maybe one more, and that's it. There's like nothing left. We still don't know anything much really about that first guy, the first assassin. We know a lot more about the second one, and none of it is is going to make you calm down a little bit and think like, oh, there's nothing there. This is fine. So, but that also is going to be out of the news cycle in maybe a week or so, and people just move on. Things that normally like 10, 15, 20 years ago you would say like, holy crap, this happened. Okay, we need to investigate this. This should never happen again. No, it's 2 days, it's a week, and then it's like moving on to the next thing. So how can people manage that? From your perspective.
So I really like the point you made there a few sentences ago about like trying to be objective, that observational objectivity, and this isn't the assassin show, so
Yeah, I just want to move away from that quickly.
I think it's a great subject because Trump aside, there have been other assassination attempts in Europe that again barely deemed newsworthy. Was it Slovenia or Latvia and Czech Republic? I think there's been actions taken against heads of state or whatever the case may be. And just as you were talking, it's almost like it's got enough media coverage to normalise it that this is kind of, we're at the stage, this is acceptable now and nothing more. And that's what gets terrifying for me, because if we're talking about propaganda, what is it actually? It's the influencing of people's thoughts around a thing. So it's about creating, crafting and holding a narrative. And you do that by the use of information or the denial of information. So bot farms, as you mentioned earlier, are basically a necessity because those voices of opposition have just been silenced and removed in the West. Like think about how many news sources you now cannot access unless you've got a hidden VPN. Yeah. It's like the West has just decided you can't see RT, Al Jazeera, or these news agencies anymore. We don't want you listening to the information you put out for our own protection, because obviously we're all child that need to be looked after by the nanny state. And so crafting of the narrative, and that's, I very much don't look at the news anymore. We said that before the record. It's like, and for your own health, and this is a point I'm going to labour throughout this podcast today, for your own health and well-being, you're now going to have to start disciplining yourself to do or not do certain things. And accessing of media is the one thing you need to be very, very careful around now, just for your own sanity, quite simply. But it's looking at, when you do access it, not necessarily the commentary or the narrative, but what's the bigger purpose here? Or what am I missing? What's the absence? What's the thing that's not being talked about? So we look at the wider conflict and people get into the granularity of, who did what, the right and the wrong, the good, the bad, the black, the white, the grey. What we're missing is there's no attempt at peace negotiations. And that flies in the face of our entire history of democracy is that... what's the word? Back in the day, the guys that used to sort of go first and sort of negotiate things at state level. Not Democrats. It's completely... sorry.
Diplomacy? Is that what you mean?
Not diplomacy. There was literally a role, a job title that would mean you would go in and negotiate on your country's behalf in trade and whatever.
Like an envoy.
It'll come to me in a second. Kind of like an envoy, but there's a different word than that. It will come to me. Something like a diplomat. No peace negotiations. That's the glaring sort of absent elephant in the room here. Is where's anybody saying should we put the brakes on this a little bit? Let's introduce some discussion and dialogue into the room. And that's very dangerous because the historical precedent around that is really bad. When it's just kind of inevitable, the war's going to go on and it's going to escalate and the atrocities are going to get worse. Once enough blood's been spilt, it's almost impossible to get off. Like now you've got to settle scores. And what we know at government level is governments are historically very bad at making that jump off assessment. They let too much tribal identity get involved, and the Balkans is a classic modern case of this. That was engineered to be a 2-week conflict to juggle some borders around, and everybody got what they wanted. But they just overdid the rhetoric, and so once the killing started, they couldn't put the genie back in the bottle. They just ignited too much passion in the populace that was just not going to stop when they were told to. So we're into some serious stuff here.
Well, and this is something that you and I have been talking about for the last 2 years, is that my point is always is that war has its own logic. It's always been like that. It's always going to be like that. What seems to be the reddest of all red lines you will never cross can only a short time later look like the absolute best and only solution. And if you look at, and again, people memory hold everything, and they forget how the evolution it goes from beginning of the invasion by Russia to where we are now, everything that happened in between, and what everybody said at the time. That we're never going to be troops on the ground, and we're not going to this, not going to that. And now the whole talk is about, UK and US sending long-range missiles to Ukraine so that Ukraine can actually strike at the heart of Moscow should it want to. And okay, that sounds like an escalation to me. And Putin has publicly stated that if they do that, this is war. This is NATO going to war officially. I don't know. I want to hear your opinion on that. So if I'm not mistaken, the two arguments he made is that, A, these weapons can only be guided by satellites that Ukraine doesn't own. They don't have those. So it is no longer just giving aid to Ukraine that NATO countries would be doing, but it would be actually engaging in war. And then putting in the coordinates and all that kind of technical aspect of those long range missiles would also not be done by Ukrainians military. So that means it's done by, for instance, UK or US soldiers, which means that's an act of war. Then they're engaged in the war. So he says that, okay, that's his rationale for then we are at war. And that's basically World War III. How do you view that?
Yeah, so just before I get into the answer to that question, let's remember, if it's memory hold, let's remember 6 months into the Ukraine conflict, the thought of sending armoured vehicles was untenable because that's too much escalation. We're not sending tanks. We were at sort of small weapons and training only. So we've gone from that to everything's got thrown at it, especially for this summer's counter-offensive. And that didn't work, so now we're looking at some strategic decisions. Certainly in terms of long-range missiles, they can be physically placed in Ukraine, but no Ukraine troops are actually qualified or competent to operate them. So all the way from the targeting package, the infrastructure to actually place it on target, and literally the person pressing the button has to be Western forces. It has to be. And, people are now starting to say the quiet part out loud. There's proposals to speed up the training cycle of Ukrainian troops. They will get trained in Ukraine. So that is NATO forces in Ukraine training Ukrainians in close proximity to the front line to speed up the advancement process. That, again, beginning of the war, 1 year in, that was a red line. NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine, wherever, not even front line, on the ground, was too much of an escalation. We're already past proxy war stage. We are. And it was fascinating because I was on LinkedIn yesterday in a military veterans group, and there's some guys recruiting for a private contract. And it was literally like, we're recruiting like this competency with a requirement of relevant experience in Ukraine or Syria. And I actually privately messaged the guy, and I was like, I think you forgot, that's not public knowledge, dude. Like that's saying the quiet part out loud, right? Like in our circles, we've all known for months, if not longer, there's activity on the ground, right? That's undeniable, but it's not sort of made headlines. So it's like you might want to kind of amend your ad. And this is 15,000 people in the group. This isn't like niched off, like buried in Telegram or something. This is kind of, a relatively somewhat public facing group on LinkedIn. It's like you've obviously been around this so long now that you've forgotten, like, you're not meant to say that. So we're there already. It's now just looking at what's the impact at the smaller level. The geopolitical stuff we can't steer. We're just trying to keep up with it. And you even get to a point of like, what's the point in trying to keep up with it? It's like, when you see the mushroom cloud, you know what's happened. And I don't want to be flippant on that. So it's about sort of taking that assessment of tempo and likelihood and saying, how does it affect me now? And this is the stuff that has the potential to reach out and touch everybody. Last time we spoke, we were looking at repatriation of Ukrainians, keeping the fight, the impact on not commissioning, whether certain other adjacent nations were going to start increasing their armed forces, what that would look like in terms of conscription was a specific point we looked at. That's all happening. Everybody's upping their budgets, everybody's jiggling their numbers, everyone's starting to get things registered, and it's like, you might end up going somewhere you're not particularly keen on very soon. And if you haven't sort of gained that out or planned around that or made an exit strategy, that's when you get caught flat on your feet saying, who could have seen this coming? We're telling you right now, it's already coming.
Yeah. And it's also, it's very difficult to talk about these kind of things with people who just casually follow the news or are just mainly buying everything from mainstream media, when just watching the evening news, which is like 10, 15 minutes maybe, and then you think you're informed, and you never talk about really the in-depth stuff. Well, how exactly is that going to happen? Like the point that we just discussed. Well, actually, these long-range missiles, this is how it works. There's specific things that are involved with that, just on a technical level, and there's no way Ukrainian military can do that. So, ergo, what follows is that it's going to be US or UK, which means they are de facto at war. And then you see people's brains exploding, and they just cannot process it. They cannot process it that this is actually, if you make abstraction from who is involved, you would say that is clearly casus belli. You would just accept that if you didn't know who the players are. And then you say, well, actually, this is Western nations are involving themselves in this specific way in the Ukraine-Russia war. And they're like, oh, no, this is different. And then I'm like, okay, I'm sorry, I can't help you. You are so stuck in your ideological capture that there's just nothing that can get through to you. And like you mentioned, you listed it very well, like armored vehicles, no way. Tanks, no way. F-16s, never going to do that. They're on the way. Belgium is sending them as well. It's going to take a few years, but they're eventually going to get there. So all the red lines are crossed that we self-impose, and then people still don't think that there's an escalation. And the point I try to make then is like, okay, have we gone closer to nuclear war, or have we moved away from it? If we cross all our own self-appointed limitations. You do realize that nuclear war, nobody wins. We've learned that from movies in the 80s. The best way to play is not to play. That's how you win the game. But also that, it's still on the table. Russia's a nuclear power, and so is the US, and there's plenty of others involved as well. And once that balloon goes up, there's no coming down, because there's no off switch. You can't just make those intercontinental ballistic missiles just are bad, we turn around, we go back to base. That's not how it fucking works. So, and the elephant in the room that you mentioned, that there's no attempt to negotiate a peace. It's just not happening. There's not even discussion about it. It's still, no, gotta keep this stuff going.
And it's larger than that, because that's not the only circus in town.
Yeah.
When you look at the Middle East, Israel, this is across the board now. It's not that Ukraine sticks out as an anomalous conflict at the moment. It is just left to right, across the board, all of the conflicts occurring. There's no talk of de-escalation. And that's really concerning. I cannot stress how concerning that is, because there can be, escalation and still talk of peace. We're going to take it up here. We're going to get the stakes so high because then someone's got to blink. Like, if that's part of the strategy, great. If you're forcing somebody's hand or whatever the case may be. But the fact is just, like, there's just nothing to talk about. But there must be. There's got to be a conversation at some point of how do we actually resolve this, especially if it was a stalemate. Okay, that's one thing. we're not at stalemate. All of these things are escalating. I mean, Israel's a particularly interesting one, and even more politically contentious than Ukraine, because whilst that was the good versus evil, I mean, like the sort of pro-Hamas movement that's come out of that is just, even I'm still trying to get my head around like how that's got the traction it has and the support that it did. But unfortunately, Israel's now sort of filling its shoes of the spectre that it was made out to be. It's almost become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I mean, this is where it gets challenging, because this stuff gets deeply rooted in people. And one point I'd like to make, you were on about the sort of mainstream media there a little bit earlier. In a way, it's actually a useful tool now, because keeping up with this stuff is exhausting, and sort of trying to sort of talk around it is exhausting. And what I've actually found is some people now so acutely parrot media talking points. It tells me everything I need to know. It's like there is just no point attempting to have a conversation with you. You said, the one I got last week, what did I think of the debate? I sort of shrugged my shoulders and said I didn't really watch it because I'm not really interested. Yeah. And it was like the 4 media talking points fell out of that person's mouth. And I was like, I'm done. There's just nothing to talk about. All you are looking for is reinforcement and agreement of like, I agree with you. So that's our tribal identity sorted. You're on my side because you have swallowed these points whole, just like I have. And that's where, for me, the use in the media right now is to identify that, like, friend or foe or shades of grey, where are we at with different people? Because identifying people that acknowledge a centre exists and can talk around it right now is really important. Because I was thinking, we said about the operational tempo earlier on, it's kind of cyclical. And when you think if things start to speed up in a cyclical manner, what happens to the centrifugal force? It pushes everything out to that side. So for me, the current radicalisation is polarisation. It's people being forced out their political identities to the left and the right. Nobody wins out there on either side. We've got to hold the centre. That's where the sensibility is. So knowing who's just out on the edges is actually useful, because those are the people I'm right now quite simply acknowledging but ignoring, and desperately trying to find the people that are saying a bit, what on earth is going on? Like, what is this now? It's like, can we talk about this? Is there a conversation to be had here? And that's the people that actually, it's the sort of therapeutic borderline conversation that, like, well, there's somebody else out there that isn't just parroting, talking points, that can actually engage their brain a little bit and say, should I be worried about this? Or are you worried about this? Or what are we doing about this? And trying to establish that common ground and that shared humanity and that vision going forward, because that's what we need right now. And we're not getting it from the leadership.
But last year I wrote a post on social media about, reaching out across a broken bridge. And the analogy is that you're standing on a broken bridge that doesn't matter who destroyed it during the conflict, it's destroyed. On the other side is the opposing side. You want to come back to the middle. But obviously there's a trust issue there, given, and there might be resentment and other things. But eventually you're going to have to reach out your hand across that bridge and shake the other guy's hand. But you do so cautiously. You don't just jump over. You don't just lean. You don't put yourself in a position where he can just yank you into the abyss. No, you do so cautiously. And if he, in good faith, grabs your hand, you've got a place to start. You've got common ground. If he tries to pull you, and so you plunge to your death, then you're going to have to fight back. Obviously, you don't become naive all of a sudden, but every conflict has to either come to an end or it is going to sow the seeds of the next conflict that happens. This is how history works. This is how every peace agreement sows the seeds of the next war. And it's this inability of people to understand basic human behavior, societal dynamics, history. This has always been the case. This will always be the case as long as we're human. Right. So this polarization closes your eyes to that. And as soon as you identify with all those ideological positions that you have, the end result is that you're unable to coherently think and discuss anything or analyze it, because that filter of ideology is it's brainwashed you, and pushing against that so you can break out of it, and all of a sudden this whole world opens to you of like, oh, there's many other opinions. For instance, we've talked about this in the beginning. Go ask the people, the Indian politicians, what they think of the Ukraine-Russia war and how the West reacts. Then go to Arab countries and see what they think about it. Because they're like, that has nothing to do with us. That's you guys. We don't care. And then people here are outraged. Like, how can you think that? Yeah, okay, they've got their own crap to deal with. So maybe open your mind a little bit, and then you can, like you say, find your way back to the middle, and find where the compromise is, find where you can find common ground, so you have a functioning society. Because, like you mentioned, if the extremes, the further apart they go, the center breaks, and then society breaks down, which is what we have been seeing. And I quickly want to get back to the Middle East, because just today we had this breaking news of Israel doing the beeper attack on Hezbollah members. What I mentioned before we start recording is that on a technical level, it's very impressive. I mean, the way that mission was planned and executed is very impressive. Or on the level of psychological warfare, I think it's extremely effective. Let's say the PR battle that they always have to fight, they were losing that anyway, as expected. But I don't think this has helped, and I'm putting it mildly. So, could you give some thoughts about that whole thing and what that means and so on?
I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine this morning about this, who's recently left the military, and it was one I was, again, the audacity and the ability to deliver on it is impressive. As an objective outsider, it was like, whoever dreamt up that op, like, well done. But the precedent it sets is exceptional.
Could I just pause you for a second? So, because everybody who's losing their mind right now because of what we just said and what you just said, the way that Hamas planned and executed the attack last year is impressive. Doesn't mean we agree with it. It means that could happen under, and we've talked enough about Israeli military and secret service and so on, is how powerful they are, how professional they are, and so on. That Hamas was able to pull that off at that scale is impressive. Doesn't mean we think it's a great idea. Same thing here. The fact that you mentioned, like, okay, this is really impressive, doesn't mean that we're going thumbs up for them. So again, break out of that ideological bubble, folks. Anyway, please continue, sir.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think when you fail to respect your enemy, that's where you underestimate the conflict. And coming from a professional violence background, it's like, the view to the Iraq to Afghanistan war was entirely different, and the Iraqis were basically steamrolled, and they weren't really respected as an enemy. Like, they were a big conscript army that gave up really quick, and that's how they're talked about in Western circles. The Taliban, hell, like, we were in, like, guys were getting smashed on the West, but they were saying, like, these boys are playing hard. Like, here's a proper enemy. They respected him. We call them Terry Taliban, but we actually respected that enemy because they proved a worthy adversary. Yeah. So, like you say, we're being objective here. This isn't like if we laud something, we agree with it. It's just acknowledging, in terms of audacity and ability to deliver, this is impressive, like, breathtaking. This out. Going back to the pages, it's a very worrying precedent. That level of collateral damage that's potentially getting reported in is deeply concerning. And the thing is, like we said earlier about the assassination, it's almost like it's been normalised. What's the media narrative around this going to be? If it's just deemed like, well, that was acceptable, if it's normalised, that level of collateral damage for those gains on the battlefield, which are actually minimal in terms of the physical space occupied, like say, far more psychological, far more infrastructure impacting, where do you go from there? Like, where's the step up? What's the retaliation? What does that permit the enemy to do? In this tit-for-tat exchange, there's no discussion of peace. Everything is on major escalation. What are they going to come back with on that? They have been dealt a severe blow, but they're going to retaliate. They're not going to pack up and say, Israel won now. So we're into this tit-for-tat is a unworthy phrase to use in this level of escalation, So that's where my head's at on this very, latest sort of happenings. Is like, what's the response going to be? Same for the invasion into Russia. Incredibly impressive from the Ukrainian side. Clearly with Western assistance, support, if not leadership. They've done it and they've maintained it and they've got a foothold. But What's the pushback going to be on that? What's the counter? All this is just escalation.
And that's the thing. People, I mean, there the polarization and the team sports aspect of the way people think, like our team, the other team, and so on, is what is the pushback going to be? Well, I remember, and that was like, was it in the 80s, I think, that, injecting mercury into oranges and so on, so that they were going to be in the supermarket. That was one of the scares that people had, and that came back. I think about 10 years ago, there was an incident like that. So just imagine your kid's eating an orange, and he gets mercury that he swallows. That is going to be a gruesome death. And then there's going to be people in somewhere in the Middle East are cheering that on, and like, yeah, we did that as a revenge. It doesn't hurt the Israelis; it's going to hurt the allies. So when the gloves go off, when there are no rules and there's an escalation, that doesn't stop. Same thing here, and I just talked about this a few weeks ago with somebody. After, with the Ukraine push relatively deep into Russia, is that you guys do realize that Russia hasn't really gone all out just yet in the way that it wages war, right?
Nowhere near.
I mean, you do realize that, and they looked at me like, "What? What do you mean?" It's like, no. The really destructive force that they have, and I'm not talking about nukes. The real destruction in infrastructure, in human life, in the military power of the Ukrainian army, they haven't even done that yet. It can still go a lot further. If you think now, what is it, like 700,000 dead Ukrainians, I think was the last one I read. Could be more, because the numbers are iffy to begin with. I mean, you can easily multiply that number if they really say, what is the old phrase, let loose the dogs of war? Is that like, go, no restrictions. People have no idea.
That's on the conventional
Yeah.
warfighting aspect. If we're saying we're going to step off the escalation to nuclear war, and there's no peace alternative, then it's going sideways to asymmetric.
Yeah.
Right? And that's
You mentioned that 2 years ago.
The cyber attacks, all that's now in play. And for the other side, let's call them that, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, or whatever, it's like, but you did it first. You started this.
Yeah.
Like, you basically knew that those pages were going to be in public places. There was no way you could, what we call PID, positively ID, like that target and the collateral damage on it, because it all went simultaneously. Somebody just made the decision, push the button, that's the hack activated, boom. And whoever stood around you is kind of getting hit with that.
And we've had some.
It's easy to have the moral high ground until you lose it.
Yeah, we've had some examples of that. I mean, during the Olympic Games, the France railway system was suddenly attacked by sabotage. In Germany,
More than once.
In Germany as well, sabotage. I mean, clearly sabotage, not an accident, not something breaking down. No. Somebody destroyed that on purpose, and that's the asymmetry that we're talking about. This stuff can happen, and it still hasn't been really extreme. It can be a lot worse, where basically, certain parts of modern society break down. Why? Because they can't function anymore. Nobody understands how these big systems are, how they work to keep modern society going, and then how easily they can actually be sabotaged so that they just don't function. And then the electricity goes out, and you got no streaming water anymore. Gas is gone, and so on. All of that doesn't take that much, and it doesn't have to be an entire country. Just put the capital without electricity for a day or two. See what happens. Try Brussels, try Paris, try London. See what happens. See how people like it.
What's interesting here, Wim, is as you reflect on this summer, and especially around the cyber side of the asymmetry, you could say what we've seen a lot of is capability demonstration or show of force. It's like, we're going to demonstrate on this system that's not critical that we can get in. And I mean, don't forget the big one was the Microsoft patch, the accidental upload of the code. So either that's a completely compromised system that someone can accidentally upload a line of code and just take out 97% of the computers, or it was hacked. Either option is a bad thing. But what we've seen, I think, is certain countries clearly demonstrate how deeply embedded they are in infrastructure. And also, don't forget, a bunch of undersea cables were getting whacked by boats that were going off radar. All of this is just showing capability. and intent. We'll do it. You keep pushing, and the next cable that goes, or the next hack that comes, or the next infrastructure that goes down is going to be a major one. So the red lines are being set diplomatically, by our leading politicians. They are being backed up by actions, and this is where again you've got to use a little bit of sort of assessment of taking that news story not on face value, like the Nord Stream pipelines was a super fascinating.
I was just going to mention that.
You just got to dig a bit deeper into that and say what was the act, but what was the message? Because this is back channel communication gone wrong. It's like so. And that's why we have these conversations, because we're where a lot of people, depending on their background, just don't have the ability to understand what the message being sent is. Whereas, for me, a lot of times as I'm scrolling through the media quickly, you'll have those things that leap out at you that are like, whoa, that story is far more noteworthy than a lot of people are going to realise in terms of intent, capability, messaging, or just, not giving a shit. It's like there's a point of like, we're taking our gloves off right now, and we're letting you know that. All the classic stuff in the street fight, they're making big and they're getting you. It's just replicated at nation state level, but it's all entirely predictable.
Yeah, and there's two things I want to mention. So I want to get back to Nord Stream, but I used to know a guy, and he had a friend who was not going to mention names or anything, but he was basically the bodyguard for the person who was in some of those secret meetings during the Yugoslav war, where both parties came together and talked. And this kind of thing is typically normal in a war, especially when it concerns big nations, is that both warring parties come together and talk while they're actively trying to kill each other, while they're shooting at each other, bombing the crap out of each other. This is how it works. We've had President Biden going on the record that he hasn't spoken to Putin once since the war started. So that is abnormal, right? So people need to understand this part, is that you have this idea of how war works. You just mentioned some of the technical aspects with long range missiles. A lot of folks don't get it. They're just like, okay, there's a missile, it just happens. No, there's a whole machinery behind it. Same thing here: diplomacy, back channel communication, and so on. All this stuff is also normally always present. So that's one aspect. Then we get to Nord Stream, as you just mentioned it. Like, we talked about that when it happened, and we're like, obviously, there's only a few suspects of this, while the press was still going on. No, it's Russia trying to sow chaos, and we're like, this is your message? It's like, they've got plenty of chaos, and if they own the thing, why would they destroy it? So expensive. Now we have, like, was it last month or a little bit beforehand, that it came out that Germany is actually putting out an arrest warrant for, I think, a Ukrainian guy who supposedly was the guy on the ship, that Zelensky was aware of it, but then he said no, and then the generals did it behind his back. The US was aware of it, and the Netherlands was aware of it. Everybody knew. Since it happened, silence. None of those actors talked about it. No. It's Russia, it's bad. Or we don't know. And now everything comes out officially. This is not conjecture. This is not some internet rumor. This is, you can find all this information right now. And I'm like, folks, can you, if you look at that, so you thought it was Russian chaos sowing, okay? You were wrong about that. How do we know? About 2 years later, you can see here, this is the explanation officially that you're getting right now. This is what's happening. Can you see the disconnect between both? Can you see how what you originally thought and the way you were told this in the news from politicians and so on, from officials and so on, is that doesn't gel with reality? Can you now apply that same principle to everything else? Is the gentleman amnesia effect in a way where you read something in the news that that is your expertise, you see it's wrong, and you're like, this is wrong, this article is wrong, and then you read the next article of which you don't know all that much, and you're like, I guess that's true. No, don't develop that kind of amnesia. Be a little bit more discerning and skeptical towards basically everything, because everybody's trying to sell you something. Doesn't matter, good guys, bad guys, neutral guys. Everybody has an agenda, and that's normal.
And I think it's important to say at this stage, we reference historical precedent a lot, playbooks and normalcy and baseline. But there's also, let's call it the unicorn in the room, if not the elephant, the new guy in town, which is AI. in terms of like your information that you're accessing, everything is now compromised. And it's funny, I was on YouTube a couple of days ago, just kind of scrolling around, just not doom scrolling, just kind of wandering around, had a bit of time. And the amount of AI generated content on there now already is just like absolutely insane. And it's still relatively easy to spot because it's a lot of kind of clickbait titles and sort of warm fluffy kittens and puppies, and they're just trying to get the views up, like
Yeah.
get the file, get the channel established. But it's not going to be long, and there's already some exquisite scams out there that are using AI generated Zoom conversations, whatever the case may be, that you're not even misinformation, disinformation, your AI generated information is going to be imperceptible from the real thing. And that's why for me, I've been ratcheting back for months about media consumption anyway, and especially the news. And I was talking to a friend of mine who works in education in the UK, and he's heavily involved in AI projects in the education sector and this, that, and the other. And I was saying to him, I can see a policy soon that for duty of care and due diligence for employees, it's going to like mandate you need to be off your devices for this amount of time per day or per week for your own health. Like the internet is going to become such a toxic, confusing space. It's going to be unreal. And we're well on our way there already. So if you couldn't trust what you thought you knew already, Big Brother AI coming in on the scene, it's the worst possible time in a way, because it just muddies every single water now. And how long is it before somebody can be watching this and saying, I'm not sure if that's really Toby, and I'm not sure if that's really Wim, and I'm not sure if this conversation actually happened, and if it did, I'm not sure this is what they said.
I've got something to say about that.
We're very close to that already. Right now. Very
we're
close.
Here, and I'll explain a bit. Two things. First thing, some 15 years ago, I was a consultant for a social media startup that was focused, specifically towards first responders, police, military, and so on. It was an epic failure for a variety of reasons that I won't go into. But I remember some of the stuff that the guy doing the technology part on that startup was involved as well on a governmental level. I'm not going to mention it here, but there was some stuff that I was like, oh, this is interesting. How governments will use social media. Now, fast forward to today, 2024. So we were joking about, before we started recording, about my new software that I'm using. It's a service, right? So what I didn't tell you is that we get full HD normally. You record locally, so do I. So we get the highest quality audio video on our own computers, gets uploaded to the cloud, and then it automatically merges the audio and video to a coherent whole. What I didn't mention is that what's particular to this software, it is going to do a transcript immediately. Now, that transcript is also, if I want, where I edit. So I can delete words, I can add words, and you will hardly see anything in the video. A little bit maybe, depending on where and how I do that. On the audio, imperceptible. I can remove all the ums and ahs if I like, and they're going to be gone. It's going to be hardly imperceptible. So obviously, Toby, there's a level of trust between us that I will not do that. I don't edit my stuff if I can help it. And so this technology is available to anybody right now. It's not that expensive. It's not necessarily cheap, not $5 a month, but you can do that. I can release a video in which I just switch the words. I switch Russia to Ukraine. So what you said is it just has the opposite meaning, and it goes viral, and there will be no way to say to see that it's or almost impossible to see for the layperson that I actually manipulated that audio and video. And it's not going to be a deep fake. It's not AI generated. It's your voice, your video that we're recording right now that I will have switched. So, and this is just me in my little office in Belgium doing that with easily available commercial software. Not even talking about what government level stuff can do.
Right. So, and I think that's a great point to make, that going back to my previous point, just expand on it slightly. So yeah, the software already exists. It's just that societal consciousness of it. I don't think many people are asking themselves that. The cynicism's not there yet, where they're saying, is this what this is? But having said what you've just said, I think it's not going to be long before people, some people that are already struggling are going to be struggling terribly and those that haven't struggled until now are going to enter this kind of twilight zone of like, I literally just don't know what to believe
Yeah.
anymore. Every single news story is going to be like, I don't like, did that even happen? Is this real? And it's funny because I'm about talking to friends. I was fortunate. I was in the city the other day, and I was talking to a friend of mine on the concept of like the Matrix movie, and it's like, are we there yet? It's like, could we enter the Matrix but still be awake? And it was a really fun discussion. He's one of those guys that really hold in the centre, and he's very much sits across the aisle for me on a number of things. But I love hanging out talking with him because we always benefit from each other's perspective. And so he's one of those that like, only sees the kind of good in technology, and I'm just like switch it off, like Cyberdyne's coming from us. And so it was just a really interesting exploration from how we both. And again, don't get me wrong, I'm very AI adverse, but even I've had to start to adopt it now just to understand it because it is so impactful. I just can't remain willfully ignorant because you've got to at least understand some of the capability to sort of know what to gird your loins for, kind of thing. Because if you just don't know, la 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 la, you don't know what the presentation of a problem might actually be. Same in the drone space, it's terrifying for me as an infantry soldier, but I'm having to kind of force myself to go over there and understand what's going on because that is going to shape future wars for the foreseeable.
Yeah.
And so as uncomfortable as this is, like thinking for a lot of the population, you've got to go and do your homework because this is getting beamed directly into that little device in your pocket now. You can't just say it doesn't affect me. And unless you're going off-grid and digital free, which you can't, you've got to understand how this is impacting you,
Yeah, one of the impacts that I've predicted for years now, I think almost 10 years, and it's not me, it's just that I read it somewhere, I thought about it, and it actually made sense, is that there will come a time, and we're getting closer. In many ways, we're there already, but it's not government mandated just yet, as it basically is more or less in China, is that you will not be able to connect to the internet without your identity being coupled to it. You will be forced to sign in with your true identity to do anything on the internet. It's going to happen because it's the only way governments can actually manage this technological revolution that we have with instant communication worldwide, with AI, with deep fakes, and et cetera, et cetera. And already right now, people are telling me like, I don't know what to believe anymore because you see a video and it's fake, or is it real? And I tell them like, look, I watch a video, I watch a picture. First thing I do is think, is this actually real? That's the first thought. Just not making a conclusion at all. Just is this actually real or not? And then start looking for different sources and so on. If it isn't, if I don't know, I don't make an opinion. I'm like, maybe it's true, maybe it isn't. This has always been the case. There's always been disinformation. The example I always give is Julius Caesar's De Bello Gallico, where it talks about his conquest of Gaul, where basically that's a propaganda piece because he has to convince Rome to give him more money so he can keep fighting and conquering. And they don't want to because he's getting too powerful because he might take over, which he did. So, I mean, and that's over 2,000 years ago. So this is, again, we're just in a different technological era. Same tactics and principles apply. So understanding all that, I think, is it's a big part of staying sane. Is don't fall for it immediately. Just take a step back and understand that this technology exists. It's not going away, but sooner or later it's going to have consequences. Like you say, it's going to have consequences for your life. That means that the government will know everything you do online, and it will be able to limit what you can do when it doesn't like, and when you do something it doesn't like. And some people say like, if you don't do anything wrong, you've got nothing to hide. I'm like, excellent point. Who gets to decide that what is wrong? And like, yeah, but okay. Remember how freaked out everybody was when Donald Trump became president? Because he was worse than Hitler, and he was going to start new wars. It's going to crash the economy. He's back. He might be president again. So do you want to give him that power over you? Because if you give it to the other side, that you think they're going to be very responsible with it, once that tool exists, it doesn't go away anymore. This is a double-edged sword. If once you have it, it's going to cut both ways. And even the bad guys can use it then. So maybe, just maybe, think twice before you adopt all these kind of extreme things. Done ranting.
I think it's a great point that you've raised, and I think it's important. You know, what we said when we had these conversations is we sort of look back and say, so what's happened since we last spoke, and I think this is a great point to just kind of labour on that. And this is coming out of the UK. That you know, we always joked for many years around the internet about keyboard warriors, and they get that way because it's brave to, you know, there's no consequences sitting tapping behind a keyboard. The UK government's changed its opinion on that now, and you will be held responsible for your social media posts and reposts. This is where it gets really interesting, isn't it? Even just by sharing someone else's content with an opinion or without is seen as an endorsement. And they're even saying that goes outside the UK borders. We haven't had any extradition yet. I'm sure a case precedent will come soon that they will appeal a country to deport for someone to go trial. So that's the thing. Like, yeah, it's fine if you've got nothing to hide, but the rules can change overnight. And that's not conspiracy theory. That's not conjecture. That's not speculation. That has now happened. People have, in the UK, been prosecuted and jailed for social media posts or reposts under new legislation or new interpretation or enforcement of existing legislation that wasn't designed for that. And this is all about far-right extremism and hatred. But the actual start of those riots, if you care to look at what happened, you know, there was, shall we say, almost certainly an element of justification of people being upset about what they perceive as a two-standard tier of policing. So again, if you get down to the root cause of saying, was there a genuine grievance around this case? There was actually, by how it was reported. Did it escalate? Yes. Is that how much tension's in the system right now? Yes. And that's been deliberately provoked, don't forget. You know, the government followed a very clear playbook with those riots in the UK. And again, if you take your air, take a breath, take the emotion out, just take a half step back and say what actually happened there, not what did the media say happened, what actually happened was one group of people got very aggrieved about a certain case, which justified another group of people going on a very, very violent backlash, and the police under political direction made a very clear decision to give one side a pass and ruthlessly prosecute and go after the other. I'm going to leave it at that because AI is transcripting this, and that's going to be a physical copy on the internet. So I'm going to be careful what I say on social media now. But this has happened since we last spoke, and it's the UK is the test case, but there's going to be identical legislation throughout the West. Everyone's going to have their version of this. It's just when do they want to bring it to bear? So this is where I wish I could just turn off the news altogether. I really do, but you've still got to be keeping track of certain things. Sweden's been an interesting case in some of the things they've been sort of legislating around in terms of reversing migration policy and that now. So these are the things you need to be keeping track of to say, like, what's the canary in the coal mine here? Because this is a thing that it sort of barely blips your radar as it's happening. And then at some point further downstream, it becomes like, oh, I had no idea that was going to morph into this. And this now actually really personally affects me, or potentially has huge impact on me. And so it's catching it as early on as you can to digest it, assess it, and then guard yourself against it to the extent that you can in these things, or just be aware of it.
And this is also, what you see with the polarization and ideological capture is that people can no longer reason beyond first order consequences. They cannot see second or third order consequences, because this is what we're talking about. You can have two-tier policing for a while, and then you're going to get the consequences, second and third order consequences. This is the big issue, and this is true for any policy that you have. And politicians are notoriously bad at either incorporating these possible consequences further down the road and preventing them, or ignoring them, or saying, like, damn the torpedoes, let's go straight ahead. And then once they're there, they pretend that it has nothing to do with the policy that they started. We just gave the example a few minutes ago, talking about the Russia-Ukraine war. This will escalate. People say, no. And we're like, dude, wars have second or third order consequences. This is what typically happens. Doesn't mean it will always happen, but there is because we have thousands of years of history as example. There are some knowns in these kind of situations, like, okay, this is all on the table, and then we see, look, this is also happening now. This is happening. Maybe the next thing that we're saying, like, watch out for this, might also be happening. people are unable, a lot of people, not all, but a lot of people are unable to accept that a policy that might seem really, really good can have extremely negative second or third order consequences. And we're seeing, in my opinion, a lot of that play out from the last 20, 30 years, policies that just go completely, off the rails, and they're ignoring the consequences. And then what do we get then? Rising populism from the left, from the right. You don't want either side to grab power. Like we mentioned, the extremists, doesn't matter left or right. We don't want those guys in power because we know what they do. Nothing good comes of that. But this is human nature.
It is, and unfortunately, the media is not going to permit centrist
No.
conversation right now. It's too dull and boring.
Well,
They're just addicted to that. Social media cycle. That I think honestly, one of the as we look forward, as we go forward in time and look back in history, I think the 24-hour news cycle will be noted as a significant event in humanity, as like that's where a lot of our problems stem from.
yeah.
We've had histories of propaganda throughout humanity, as you say, all the way back 2,000 years. But I think that insatiable appetite for news or information and the ability to access it is far more problematic than we give it credit for.
Yeah. And I kind of disagree a little bit with that because I see this huge, huge appetite outside of mainstream media for nuanced discussion, where you see it in many, whether it's podcast form, YouTube form, and so on. You see a lot of people are looking for in-depth and nuance. It's just that the mainstream doesn't cover it, or they demonize it. Why? Because it's a threat to their system. Trust in mainstream media has been going down for years, and it's not getting any better. And at the same time, the money goes away. So they run into trouble, have to downsize, and so on. And that cycle is accelerating as well. But the rise of alternative media, podcasts, and so on has been a huge thing that is still underreported, but it's getting there. We're getting there. So I have a little bit of hope, trying to be the optimist here, that the middle ground is maybe growing a little bit here and there, but that is not doom and gloom enough for our discussions. So I'm not going to expand on that. We have to cut to the second part because we're limited for time. So we typically continue on Patreon, where my patrons ask Toby some questions. I have some interesting ones, as always, and you guys can listen to that second part. I will post the link in the show notes. If you want to find the show notes, you go to wimsblog.com/ and then the number of this episode. It's probably going to be some one in the 60s, 167 or 168, I think. So that's probably what it's going to be like. So look for that. Toby, any parting words? Quickly, maybe. What do you think we can expect for the let's say the next 6 to 8 months, maybe?
So I think this election cycle is going to be incredibly problematic. It has got potential to really go sideways. Like they don't happen. Some like massive disruptive acts. It's like everything's on hold. So we are right on the lip of that precipice. I hope it doesn't. I hope it sort of goes through and we come out the other side. But I'm definitely holding that position of being prepared to see multiple elections suspended, especially if America goes first. If they legitimize it, then every Western country that's got an election that they're sort of unsure about will follow suit. So there is definitely some big potential. I think if we go beyond that, winter's a weapon. I think we're going to have a number of problematic extreme weather events in general, not linked to any particular conflict, but those in conflict are going to absolutely use Russia and Ukraine especially. I think the Russians are going to seize on this winter and capitalise as much as they possibly can, especially in the asymmetric sphere. So I would definitely be looking at compromise to energy infrastructure, heating, lighting, that kind of stuff. Again, that escalating capability demonstration. I think all of that, even if it might happen, is there's nothing we can do about it. I think taking it down to the individual level, as well as being well prepared for, you should be prepared for routine power outages in the cold in the winter anyway, regardless of who's like flicking the switch or not. I think the one thing that's notable from my side, with the polarization, with the momentum, and with the arms coming out of Ukraine, which is now confirmed by multiple sources, even though we speculated on it 2 years ago, is any civil disturbance that kicks off. You can anticipate if there is organised criminal elements involved in that, which there will be because they're looking to capitalise, they are going to be far more armed, equipped, and ready to go than ever previously. So, your baseline level of violence in whatever city or town you live in, I would be prepared for a significant lift up on what you might be exposed to and the sort of scale of that. So if you're if your baseline is at stabbings, expect shootings. If your baseline is at shootings, expect mass shootings. If you're at mass shootings, expect more mass shootings with more people and more automated weapons. I don't enjoy saying any of this, by the way. I take no pleasure in making these assessments, but I think it's really important to throw them out to start the discussion, because that's the thing. We've got too much self-censorship right now of people just not wanting to say the wrong thing and get deplatformed, whatever the case may be. I think quite simply, I hope and aspire for peaceful times. I think we're going to have to pass through a period of exceptional violence to get there. These generations in existence now have not seen the bloodshed enough. None of our grandparents are still here, or those that aren't listened to. The lessons from the Second World War are lost. Yeah. And it was interesting for me now on the 18th of September as we record this, never forget seemingly has a 23-year shelf life. Like 9/11 this year for me was particularly muted. Now, is that algorithm? Is that actuality? I don't know. But it was notable, very notable for me. And actually 12/11, is that the right way around? No. 12/9, 9/12, whichever they do it the wrong way in America. The day after that sort of remembrance, that was a lot of chatter in the circles I move in. It was literally, so we forgot them. Yeah. That's it. Generations have moved on. The generations underneath us, because we're the old men now, even though we don't feel like it, haven't seen the bloodshed. They haven't learned the lessons, and they're looking quite enthusiastic to go for them. Those are the times we live in.
Yep. I wish I could disagree, but I don't. And in the only thing that we will, eventually that this younger generation will have to do is learn this lesson the hard way. We've talked about before about, the many different Western countries, especially in Europe, are pushing towards military service, voluntary service, and so on. Yeah. Why do they suddenly need a lot more soldiers? Why do you think? Why would a country ask of its young citizens, like, enlist in the army, enlist, do so? Why do you think that is? And then I see people in their 20s and 30s looking at me like, what do you mean? I'm like, okay, read a history book. I can very much recommend Dan Carlin's blueprint to Armageddon about the First World War, where he talks about the recruiting and how that went, and how it went with shaming in small British towns where the women would walk up to the young men and, why are you not fighting? Why are you here? Shame on you. Where you were pressured into that and so on. You think this won't happen this time? Do you think that's going to go away? It's anyway. We are moving on to the second part, folks. As always, thanks for listening. If you want to listen to the second part, got to become a patron. My Patreon has been going for 6+ years. There are literally hundreds of videos, instructional Q&As, and bonus podcast episodes on there with a bunch of guests. And then you can also get to ask your questions to future guests. So I would very much recommend doing that. And you can see that link in the show notes. In the meantime, Toby, thank you very much. And we are switching over to Patreon. Bye, folks.